So we're going to start with a map of Plymouth. So here's Plymouth, Plymouth Sound. So Plymouth was a major naval and commercial port, has a long history and unique heritage as a global point of departure. This is seen also through the export of a sense of identity, whereby this Devon port has given its name to over 40 other Plymouths worldwide in a sustained exercise in global heritage dating back to the early 17th century. So 32 US cities and towns share the name of America's hometown, typically in recognition of the flight from the persecution of the Puritan separatists to Massachusetts in 1620. So Plymouth, Wisconsin, for example, was settled in the 19th century by direct descendants from Plymouth Colony. Plymouth, Minnesota is the largest, with around about 74,000 population, and apparently in 2008 was voted the #1 US town city to live in by US Money magazine. The smallest is in North Dakota, around 50 people. There's 4 in Wisconsin, 3 in Ohio, 2 in Michigan. So certainly strong representation over in North America. In November 1840, a successful pioneer expedition of 150 people sailed from Plymouth on the William Bryan to lay the foundations of a new town on the west coast of New Zealand, New Zealand's North Island, called New Plymouth, and that was settled in March 1841. A royal charter granted the Plymouth Company land rights, and a few months later 3 more ships left Plymouth for the New World. Between 1841 and 1843, 920 farmers and labourers from the southwest arrived. Other Plymouths can be found in Nova Scotia, in the Caribbean, again underlying Plymouth's global place in history. And there's also a scattering of Devonports and stone houses, and I'll mention those sort of next, really. So Plymouth originally with an I, not a Y, you can see here, but it comprised of, as it developed, 3 growing towns. So we have Plymouth, Devonport and East Stonehouse. So Plymouth's over on the right, Devonport's over here on the left, and East Stonehouse is sort of in the middle of the two. And these were originally very separate and distinct towns. It was not until 1914, with the First World War looming and the need to pool resources, that these so-called 3 towns amalgamated into the modern city of Plymouth. So going back to sort of the 16th century, the town of Plymouth was the main commercial port for maritime traders in the southwest, from where one of its most notable pioneers, Sir Francis Drake, as much a privateer and early slave trader as a circumnavigator, departed from Sutton Pool Dock, which is over there. As trade between the southwest and the empire increased, Sutton Pool and the dock became less sort of viable, and it was more expensive for ships to arrive and pay dues. So ships started to anchor over here in the Hammos, a couple of miles away, and there was talk of siting a naval dockyard there. Concerned about the vulnerability of the southwest, William III agreed to establish the Western Squadron over on the Hammos, and construction started there in 1691. And as a result of that, a new town known as Plymouth Dock gradually began to grow to sustain the dockyards. After the success of the Napoleonic Wars and the need to maintain a defensive fleet, this new town really flourished. So by 1800, Plymouth Dock was the largest town in the southwest, bigger than Bristol and half as big as Plymouth, its sister town. At around the same time, 150 miles away from New Plymouth in New Zealand, the small community of Flagstaff in Auckland was settled. In 1859, it was deliberately renamed Devonport because that's where the New Zealand governor decided and selected the location to become the home of the Royal New Zealand Navy. And in Tasmania, the towns of Torquay and Formby were amalgamated into another new town called Devonport. So sandwiched in between the two, we have East Stonehouse, so called because of the very impressive Royal William victualling yard. If you come to Plymouth, definitely worth a visit to go and visit the amazing architecture there. So this was the victualling yard for the Royal Navy, built in 1826. So although all 3 towns coexisted in close geographic proximity, each had their own individual identity with predictable rivalries. And while there was some sort of cooperation, Devonport was always the one kind of most resistant to amalgamation, and sort of Little Stonehouse in the middle tended to curry town with whichever of the bigger ones best served its purpose. But it's a measure of the importance of the memories taken with them by so many of the emigrants from Plymouth that so many global locations have these direct and indirect links with the original British port. But this disseminating of geographical identity was not the sole export that needs to be considered, or is not the sole export to be considered here. As well as colonial pioneers and a stream of emigrants over the centuries, Plymouth is associated with some highly notable global pathfinders who you will know. Obviously including Drake, but also Robert Falcon Scott. So explorers have left from Plymouth, and people like these have had an enduring global impact. The epic voyages of James Cook and Charles Darwin also left from Plymouth, as did the two convict ships, the Friendship and Charlotte, as part of the first fleet to Australia. Captain Robert Falcon Scott was born in Devonport 150 years ago this month, in fact, and his discovery and ill-fated Terra Nova expedition was supported by the Marine Biological Association, which was founded in Plymouth in 1884 and continues its groundbreaking research today, currently working on plastic pollution in oceans. So Plymouth has a very strong claim to be the centre point of the global heritage compass rose, but its reach goes much deeper than these renowned continental and oceanic pathfinders, and is the vision and innovations of some of our less well-known Plymouthians and their international significance, both actual and metaphorical, in establishing new physical, philosophical and scientific words whom I want to introduce you to. And I'm going to start with Thomas Mudge. So on the theme of compasses and navigation, how many here have heard of Thomas Mudge? James. He deserves to be recognised by all of us. So he's very much Father Time, and Plymouth Maritime Location acknowledges that time and tide wait for no one. But Mudge really was Father Time, described as England's greatest watchmaker. He created one of the first portable balance-controlled locks, invented the lever escarpment, which was a major innovation in horology that ensured the hands ticked at a steady rate to provide more accurate timekeeping. His innovation was the blueprint for most modern wrist and pocket watches, was taken up in the 19th century by Swiss precision manufacturers. So he also produced the first pocket watch to include an automatic device which compensated for changes in temperature. In 1771, he retired to develop more marine timekeepers that could be used for navigation. If extant time could be measured against a time standard specification based on astronomical observations aligned with the Earth's daily rotations, then this could identify a ship's longitudinal position. And for the Royal Navy, this was crucial. Creating a device to determine longitude was so important that in 1714, Parliament offered £20,000, 2 million today, to such person or persons as shall discover the longitude. In 1774, Mudge sent his first sort of trial marine chronometer to the Board of Longitude for trials at the Royal Greenwich Observatory. But it was his rival, John Harrison, who won the prize in 1775. But Harrison created a much more inferior chronometer, while Mudge's was still being tested on a 2-year trip, travelling thousands of miles around Europe, and kept accurate time through that whole process. Too much of a gentleman to criticise the winner, Mudge kept lobbying the Board of Longitude, and nearly 20 years later, in 1793, the King finally agreed to award him £3,000. Mudge died a year after, but his 8-day marine chronometer that he invented and developed could not be bettered for more than a century. So I've placed the Mudges at the nexus of my Plymouth connections, partly due to Thomas's work, given the fundamentality of measuring time, but also because this Plymouth family was so prominently socially connected globally. This was not so much through Thomas, but more through his brother, Dr. John Mudge. Married 3 times, he fathered 20 children. Like his brother, John was also an inventor and a scientist. He was a student at the Plymouth Hospital, built up an extensive practice as a surgeon and physician, and invented a number of surgical instruments. Before the invention of glass mirrors, the reflective curves on telescopes were made from metal, and Mudge worked out the best combination of metals to make the most effective telescopic speculum. Presenting Mudge with a gold medal in recognition of his work, Sir John Pringle, President of the Royal, said, "Mr. Mudge has truly realised the expectation of Sir Isaac Newton, who had predicted such an invention 100 years earlier." So they must have needed quite a large trophy table at the Mudge household. Just as his brother's inventions, though, were overshadowed by Robinson, Sir Edward Jenner was credited in 1798 with developing the vaccination procedure for smallpox. Yet Mudge had first advocated the use of cowpox inoculation in his 1777 dissertation on the inoculated smallpox. After 30 years of practising inoculation, Mudge professed never to have lost a single non-infant patient. And in a further Plymouth footnote, while Jenner called his new procedure vaccine inoculation, from the Latin vacca meaning cow, it was actually another Plymouth surgeon, Richard Dunning, who first coined the term vaccination in 1803. But it's Mudge's social circle and the ripple effects of his connections that stimulated Plymouth's wider reputation. Mudge's father was prebendary here at Exeter, and he was a close friend of the Reynolds family. And John and Thomas went to school with Sir Joshua Reynolds in Plymouth. So Reynolds, I'm sure many of you know, acknowledged as one of the major European portrait painters of the 18th century, and all the images in this period are by him. Had petitioned King George III to create the first Royal Academy of Arts, one of the most influential movements in art history. Founded 250 years ago in 1768 at Somerset House. Reynolds was elected its first president, painted King George and Queen Charlotte, and many acclaimed portraits, including Dr. Samuel Johnson, the playwright David Garrick, and statesman Edmund Burke, who you can see if you come to Plymouth at Saltram House. There's a collection of his paintings there. And Reynolds also brought these friends he'd met in London down to stay with the Mudgers. And also another renowned and prolific Plymouth-born painter kind of joined the group, James Northcote, who penned a biography of Reynolds and is credited again with around 2,000 works. So art and literature connect then through Dr. Johnson. So painted by Reynolds, 1783, he regularly stayed with John Mudge, becoming godfather to his children, and a copy of Mudge's vaccination book was found in Johnson's library, inscribed with his note that Mudge practised with great reputation. Johnson really enjoyed visiting Plymouth, noting its society was very good. When the new town, though, at Plymouth Dock was expanding, Johnson expressed his displeasure. This new and rising town could not but excite the envy and jealousy of the old, in which conjecture I have been very soon confirmed. Johnson made his position very clear. I am a Plymouth man. He wasn't, he's from elsewhere, but I am a Plymouth man. These dockers are merely upstarts and aliens. Another anecdote relates to the new town's continued request to the Plymouth Corporation for a water supply, which kept being refused, and an alderman from the corporation sought Mudge's support while Johnson was staying with him down in Plymouth. And the alderman was most delighted to be able to tell everyone that Dr. Johnson sides with Plymouth. He told me I would let the rogues die of thirst, for I hate a docker from my heart. So continuing with our connections from social circles, 12 miles off the entrance to Plymouth Sound is the Eddystone Reef, named after the swirling eddies that wrecked numerous ships. A lighthouse built of wood marked the western approaches and entrance to the English Channel. The first and most welcome last waypoint for all Plymouth pioneers, Pathfinders and sailors who would cry, "The Eddystone is in sight." I still do this when I sail across the Channel every summer as well. But it was swept away by storm in 1703. Another replacement lasted 50 years, but that too burnt down in 1755. With loss of life, the lighthousemen perished in the fire. Many believed it was impossible to construct a more permanent stone tower on this very small reef. So in 1756, the engineer John Smeaton, who had surveyed waterways in Holland and Italy, was commissioned to design a new lighthouse, and he was introduced to Mudge. They became close friends. He commissioned a watch from Mudge's brother Thomas. Smeaton used to go up onto Plymouth Hoe to watch the building progress through his telescope some sort of 12 miles away. It was completed in 1759, and on completion, Smeaton climbed right to the top of the tower, which was 120 feet tall, to place the screws and the little gold ball there right on the top of the cupola. But 3 years later, in 1762, there was a massive storm. Smeaton was no longer living in Plymouth because he'd completed his commission, but Mudge wrote to him saying, "The waves have destroyed all the shops on Sutton Harbour. 6 large merchant ships had run aground. 5 men of war lost their masts and bowsprits. But through my telescope, I could see the gilded ball had survived the storm." So the lighthouse stood for 125 years until surveyors concluded that although the column was still good, its actual foundations were beginning to crumble from the continual pounding of the waves. So in 1885, Smeaton's tower was re-erected on the Hoe, funded by local subscriptions, and it's now Plymouth's iconic beacon, serving not only as a memorial to one of the world's greatest engineers and the incalculable number of lives that he saved, but as a permanent physical representation of Plymouth's global heritage. Mudge also knew the prominent Devonian and industrialist William Cookworthy, a Quaker and eminent chemist, who he introduced to Dr. Johnson and also to Smeaton. Cookworthy lost his father while young, but at 14 secured an apprenticeship with a chemist in London, walking all the way because he couldn't afford the coach fare. Cookworthy was the first manufacturer to produce porcelain in the UK, which then could only be imported from China. And he also invented a process to manufacture hard paste china using china clay quarried from Cornish mines, thereby avoiding the need to import clay more expensively from Virginia. But to build his lighthouse, Smeaton needed a form of lime mortar that was water resistant and would dry quickly. And so he presented this challenge to his friend Cookworthy. Cookworthy developed hydraulic lime specifically for Smeaton's tower that set in more extreme conditions and had a higher compressive strength than ordinary air lime mortar. And this was subsequently developed into Portland mortar and then later on into the more ubiquitous cement. So that's one little group of connections, and now I'm going to go back to Mudge. Mudge's chronometer made it easier to navigate, and this connects sort of another group of Plymouthians, Sir George Arthur, or starting with Sir George Arthur, who was born in Plymouth. He joined the army at 20, became a lieutenant colonel serving in Egypt, Sicily and the Honduras. A supporter of emancipation, associates included Wilberforce, James Stephen and Noel Bathurst. But as a fervent Calvinist, he believed the heart of every man was desperately wicked. In 1823, he was sent to Van Diemen's Land to sort out the convict prison, and 2 years later, when Macquarie made it an independent colony, he became Lieutenant Governor at Hobart. An efficient administrator, Arthur introduced a system of graded incentives and punishments backed up with religious instruction. In 1830, he set up Port Arthur. No unnecessary modesty here. Discipline was severe, but the timber-related work, stripping forests, sawing, was unremitting and hard. His overriding aim was to make the men and 1/5 women convicts suitable employees for settlers. Arthur became very rich and powerful. He grabbed Aboriginal land and drove and exterminated the indigenous population away from the colony behind what became known as the notorious Black Line. Selling his properties later to take up the Lieutenant Governorship of Upper Canada in 1836, released £50,000, 3 million today, and later he would become Governor, President of Bombay and a Major General. Port Arthur is now a world, in fact it was the very first world's heritage historic site, again reinforcing Plymouth's international influence. So linking the colonial antiquities, Thomas Mudge, and World Heritage Sites is Robert Fitzroy, who joined the Navy at 14. Although not a Plymouthian, he is best known as commander and captain of the Beagle, which set sail from Plymouth in 1832. In the shadow of the more eponymous Darwin, who he recruited for the voyage, his mapping of South America for the Royal Admiralty was really important work. In 1843, he seized the opportunity to become Governor of New Zealand, but found the fledgling colony in turmoil and virtually bankrupt. In contrast to George Arthur, he tried to protect the indigenous Maori tribes from land grabs. But when he pardoned a Maori chief who had massacred 19 settlers, he was recalled to Britain in disgrace after just 2 years in charge. There's a mercy one for you, James. However, it's his pioneering research in meteorology, predicting daily weather systems, which he called forecasts, as much maligned then as today, and creating the storm barometer that's more significant globally. He founded the Met Office, was Fellow of the Royal Society, Chief of the Meteorological Division of the Board of Trade, but tragically this great prognosticator of the weather unexpectedly took his own life, cutting his throat with a razor, believed due to depression from the negative criticism he'd received about his weather predictions. Two other Plymouth connections with Empire. Here we have Major General Linnaeus Tripe, born in Devonport. He was an officer in the East India Company, but also a pioneering photographer who documented the architectural heritage of Mysore, Burma, and was official photographer to the Madras government. For a short period. His photographs illustrated the splendours discovered in the colonies, which obviously then fascinated the public back home. And Lieutenant Colonel John Shard, born in Plymouth, a commissioned lieutenant in the Royal Engineers, posted to South Africa at the beginning of the Anglo-Zulu War. In 1879, at the age of 31, he was forced to defend Rorke's Drift, a small garrison with a commissariat, I'm sure you're aware, and hospital that with 80 men was hopelessly outnumbered. And he famously constructed a wall of biscuit tins and mealie bags to provide protection, repelling numerous Zulu attacks before reinforcements arrived. 370 of 3,000 Zulus were killed, just 15 British were killed and 12 wounded. And in dispatches, Chard took no praise for himself, but he was awarded the Victoria Cross. Later in Plymouth, the mayor presented him with the Sword of Honour for having done his duty with unflinching honour and connecting again back to Thomas Mudge, a gold chronometer. So far, no women are represented, but they play a significant role too. And as this is the centenary year of the Representation of the People Act, my last kind of group of connections start with Dr. Mabel Ramsey, the first female surgeon gynaecologist at Plymouth City Hospital. She broke many medical boundaries, including founding the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists, was one of the founder members of that. The daughter of a naval officer and his Bermuda-born wife, she always had a global vision. During the Great War, she volunteered with the Belgian Red Cross in Flanders and was awarded the Mons Star with Bar. A feminist campaigner, she was a liberal, she was a suffragist. She founded the Plymouth branch of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Society and continually and relentlessly agitated for women's rights, better child welfare and protection, the provision of women magistrates and women police. And she also founded the Plymouth branch of the growing Soroptimist movement in 1930, which, as I'm sure many of you know, started in California in 1921 as a movement for women to act in sisterhood, again to improve the status and rights of women. So on the subject of American women, that kind of takes us nicely to Nancy Astor. So Mabel knew Lord Astor and his wife Nancy. The two women often campaigned together on various feminist and women's interests. Nancy, born in Virginia and privileged to live in the Astor family home at Cliveden, she too was a feminist and political activist. She was liberal and prohibitionist, though she was never part of the suffrage movement. When her husband was offered a peerage and a seat in the House of Lords, she decided to stand in his Plymouth Sutton constituency. The local electorate clearly heeded some of Dr. Mabel Ramsey's words in electing her, and Nancy was instrumental in securing the Equal Franchise Act in 1928, which reduced the age of women who now became entitled to vote at the age of 21, whereas the 1918 legislation had the ceiling of women aged 30. So not only the first woman to take a seat in the Commons, she was unconventional, controversial and witty, winning 7 consecutive elections and elected Lady Mayoress during the Second World War and retired in 1945. So Plymouth, with its history of non-conformity, as Judith was talking about this morning, also produced another political dynasty with the Foote family. So Isaac Foote, a radical and Liberal Party leader, became president of the Liberal Party, and his son Michael Foote became leader of the Labour Party. Both were hugely admired as social democrats within their respective political constituencies, though neither made it to Prime Minister. So that's just a quick kind of tour of a few connections of some of the lesser-known Plymouthians. So, conclusion, geographically removed and viewed by the metropolis as almost at the end of the line, though Penzance is another 2 hours further, Plymouth was politically and spiritually distanced from Devon's county town and the high church Anglicanism of its cathedral. Not formally recognised as a city until 1928, it has often been regarded as having only one footnote of importance in Britain's history, and that of its relations with the wider world. But to any local historian, it is no surprise that there is much more to it than Plymouth Hoe and the Pilgrim Fathers. From the pioneering days of Drake through Plymouth's parliamentarian stance in the Civil War, the pathfinding perseverance of the Pilgrim Fathers, Devonport's safeguarding of the western approaches and the city's destruction in the Blitz, Plymouth's 3 towns sought to maintain their independence and non-conformity. Such autonomous and unconventional fortitude engendered a spirit of perseverance and discovery, epitomised in Plymouth's distinctive global pioneers and pathfinders. That's it, thank you.